Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another video. Yes, I know I'm a few days late to reviewing this movie, but you know what they say, better late than never, and tomorrow will be Christmas Day, but I'm getting this review done before December season begins. But happy Thanksgiving everyone. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving with your families, but I figured, what the heck, since this movie takes place on Thanksgiving and it's a beloved comedy classic, I might as well review this movie. And today's comedy I'm going to be reviewing is the 1987 movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, starring John Candy, Steve Martin, and of course, directed by John Hughes. Now, I mean, this is a beloved classic. I mean, what more can I really say about this movie that hasn't already been said by everyone? But anyways, what is the plot to this movie for those who don't know? Well, the plot of this movie is as follows. Steve Martin and John Candy star in John Hughes' classic tale of holiday travel gone away. Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, is an uptight advertising executive trying to get home to Chicago for Thanksgiving. When his flight is rerouted to Wichita, he reluctantly partners with Del Griffin, played by John Candy, an obnoxious yet lovable salesman. Together, they embark on a cross-country adventure that includes various modes of transportation, hilarious mishaps, and unforgettable rental car shenanigans. And I agree with Roger Ebert on this statement. Rest in peace. Now, I do like Roger Ebert as a critic. Granted, I do not agree with most of his opinions, but even then, I still find his older stuff entertaining. But anyways, and he was a fan of this movie, and I agree with his statement here. Well, it was Roger Ebert who said it, but Roger Ebert said, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is a screwball comedy with heart and a perfect holiday treat that lasts all year. I 100% agree with that. And when the movie was released in November of 1987, it received positive reviews from critics and audiences, and it was a smash hit at the box office. And this is really the movie that put John Candy on the map as an actor, because after this, he would star in movies like Uncle Buck, Home Alone, and a lot of these well-known classic family comedy movies. And I would say this isn't quite my favorite movie directed by John Hughes. I would give the slight edge to Uncle Buck, but I still thought that this was a fantastic comedy movie. So, without further ado, let's get into the review. And if you guys have not seen this movie, stop watching this video and go watch this movie right now, because this is one of the greatest comedies of all time, and you are seriously missing out on a classic if you've never seen this. But And recently, I didn't get a chance to see it in theaters, but they put this movie back in theaters where I live due to the Thanksgiving season, which is cool. But let's get into my review. So the movie starts off where we are introduced to a character by the name of Neil Page, who is played by Steve Martin, who is an uptight advertising executive who is in a board meeting, but he gets out of the meeting. And of course, his plans are trying to get home to Chicago for Thanksgiving so he can see his children and his wife, which, okay, yeah, that's obviously something a father would want to do. However, at the beginning, we see that plans don't necessarily go as they expected, because there is a very funny part early on in the movie where Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, is staring at this guy played by Kevin Bacon, and they're both staring at a taxi, and then Kevin Bacon races into the taxi. I thought that scene was funny. And then I like the part when Steve Martin, aka Neil Page, basically runs up to Del Griffin, aka John Candy's taxi that he's in, and then and he scares him, and he's like, "You stole my stuff," and then they drive the van away. And, well, the taxi car. And then not long after that, Steve Martin's character, Neil Page, is in the airport sitting next to Del Griffin, played by John Candy. He's like, "Do I know you?" He's like, "I knew you." And then Steve Martin says, you stole my cab." And he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. Let me make it up to you. Let me buy you something." But, Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, keeps declining and stuff like that. And I really like Neil Page in this movie played by John Candy because, yes, he is an obnoxious character, but at the same time, he's a lovable salesman and he's very funny. This is an example of how you do an obnoxious character right. There's an example of the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it, where there is a way you can make an obnoxious character actually funny and likable. There's an example of how to do it the right way and the wrong way, and this movie is how you do it the right way. And early on in the movie, Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, he's basically throughout the course of the movie, he's pretty much annoyed with the main character, Del Griffin, played by John Candy, and he finds him obnoxious. Well, obviously, and I love the part when Del Griffin, played by John Candy, is sleeping next to Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, and then, Del Griffin wakes up and says, "My left nut says $6 and my left nut says we don't live in Chicago," which obviously doesn't happen because of the bad weather. The plane had to get rerouted. So then our main so that night, Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, and Del Griffin, played by John Candy, they stayed the night in a hotel and stuff like that. And I just love their back and forth banter between each other. And I thought that Steve Martin and John Candy were perfectly casted in these roles. I love the whole part, the next morning where Del Griffin, played by John Candy, is sleeping next to Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, hugging him. And Steve Martin says, "Where's your other hand?" And then Del Griffin, played by John Candy, says, "Between two pillows." And they're like, "Those aren't pillows." And then they get out of bed, panicking. Like, I thought that scene was funny. And then the next morning, they're at a restaurant, about to pay a bill. However, they notice that money is... Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, notices that money is missing. And he accuses Del Griffin, played by John Candy, of stealing it. But he obviously didn't, because as we saw at nighttime in the hotel room, the character played by Kevin Bacon, who chased him earlier at the beginning of the movie, he essentially pick-locked the door and stole the money and pick-locked it shut. But yeah, and then they decide to go on a train to get there to their destination, but because of the bad weather, the train has to stop. So then they eventually have to go to the airport. And my favorite scene of this movie by far. Now, what's interesting about this movie compared to other movies directed by John Hughes, now, at the time this movie came out, John Hughes was a very popular, well-established movie director. He made his directorial debut with the 1984 comedy movie Six Candles, which is a classic. And then he did the 1985 drama movie The Breakfast Club, which is also another classic. And then, just before this, he had done... two comedies back-to-back with Weird Science, but in 1986, he directed Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which I don't think it's quite as good as this movie or Uncle Buck, but I still think it's a good movie. And now, all those movies were rated PG. However, this movie's rated R, but here's the thing with this movie, though. This is one of those movies that you could honestly argue that this movie did not need to be rated R, because there isn't really anything, minus the exception of one scene, which is the only reason this movie is rated R. I guarantee if this one scene would have been cut out, the movie would have been rated PG or PG-13, no problem, but I'm glad it was in the movie because it's my favorite part of the movie. But I love the part when Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, like, his clothes are a wreck, and, like, his hair is wet, like, his clothes is soaking wet, like, he has just had it. And then he basically goes inside the airport, and then there's this, lady at the front desk who, I know this cover's blurry, but you can see her right here, and she says, "How may I help you?" And then I love the part when Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, says, "First, you can start by wiping that effing stupid rosy smile off your stupid effing rosy cheeks." And then just the reaction of the way he's talking to her, I thought was absolutely hilarious. And stuff like that. And then she says, "What about your rental agreement for the car?" And then I love the part when Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, says, "I threw it away." And she's like, "Oh boy." And Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, is like, "Oh boy, what?" And she's like, you're effed. Like, I thought that scene was absolutely hilarious. And then throughout the course of the movie, obviously nothing's going their way. So, Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, and Del Griffin, played by John Candy, before they take off in the car, Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, gets punched in the face for being a jerk to someone. And then Del Griffin, played by John Candy, stops the car. And then I love the part when Del Griffin, played by John Candy, says, "What is your problem? Don't you see there's a man down in the road?" He says, "Look, I will move my car for these people at the airport, but I need you to help me put them in the car." And then I love the part when Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, says, "No." And then the jerk says, "With pleasure." And then he grabs him in the nuts really hard, and then he lifts him up in the car. Granted, you don't see the whole thing on screen, but that scene was very funny. And, later that night, Del Griffin, played by John Candy, is driving the car and accidentally manages to drive the car between two semi-trucks, which ends up destroying both the rear view mirrors that you need to see traffic behind you, and the car's an absolute wreck. And so John Candy's character, Del Griffin, was smoking earlier. He threw the cigar in the back, and then later, not long after that, they get out the car and they notice that the car's on fire. And then I love the part when Neil Page, played by Steve Martin's, like they're both laughing hysterically like hyenas. He says, "You did it to yourself," and stuff like that. And then I love the part when Neil Page, played by Steve Martin's, like, he says, "Why would I do that?" And because he thinks that, that Del Griffin, played by John Candy, screwed up, which he did. And he's like, he says, "I thought you took the money out for kindness." And he's like, "For kindness?" And then he's like, "I can't take your driver's license out." And he's like, "Why not?" And then he's taking Del Griffin, played by John Candy, shaking it back and forth. And then Del Griffin says, "Because I accidentally left your wallet in the car," and stuff like that. And then I love the part when Del Griffin, played by John Candy, says, "Are you upset with me?" And then Neil Page just punches him in the balls, and then Neil Page trips over the luggage that they were able to recover out of the car and stuff like that. And then Del Griffin falls over, and then they eventually go to a hotel. Now, Steve Martin's character, Neil Page, he has enough money to cover for himself, but he doesn't have enough money to cover for Neil Page staying in the same room as him. So, so the hotel manager says, "Sorry, I can't accept this," but he's able to let, because obviously Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, had enough money. He allows him to sleep in the hotel, but the character, Del Griffin, played by John Candy, is about to go asleep in the car, and then Steve Martin's character, Neil Page, says, "Hey," goes outside, opens his door, and says, "You're gonna freeze out here," and he has the kindness of his heart to let him in. Now, Steve Martin's character, Neil Page, is a jerk in this movie, but he's one of the few exceptions where he's an example of how you do a jerk right, because he's a jerk, but he's a funny jerk, but also he also gets better as a character throughout the course of the movie, because he starts off as a jerk, but of course that was the intention of the movie, and I think for this movie it does work for the movie's intention. And then, throughout the rest of the movie, he grows to have a kindness of heart and starts to get attached to Del Griffin, played by John Candy, which I thought was a nice little touch. And then the next morning, when they're about to, basically leave the hotel, Del Griffin, played by John Candy, backs up the car, and he accidentally just makes a huge wall in one of the hotel rooms. And Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, says, "Quick, get in." And then they basically drive the car away, and the car's damage is so bad. I mean, the side windows are missing. I mean, because of a fire that happened. I mean, look at this car on the back of the cover. The car's an absolute wreck. But Steve Martin's character, Neil Page, is sitting right next to Del Griffin, played by John Candy, and Del Griffin is driving the car and stuff like that. However, he's pulled over by the cops for speeding, but the damage to the car is so bad that they can't even see how fast they're going with it, but the radio somehow works. And I love the part when the police officer pulls him over and he says, "You know how fast I was going?" And I love the part when Del Griffin, played by John Candy, says, "I'm so sorry," and he says, "Yeah," and then I love the part when he says, "Somehow the radio works. Of all the things that have been damaged, the radio's the one thing that works. Don't ask me how," and then he laughs at the officer, which I thought was funny, but the police officer says, "I can't allow you to travel in this vehicle." However, I like the part when Del Griffin, played by John Candy, says, "Well, I'm sorry, but if you don't allow me to go forward, I'm not going to be able to get my friend home to his family for Thanksgiving." So they bring the car to the impound, and then there's a semi-truck driver who allows them to sit in the back of their trailer to basically get a ride. And then I love the part close to the end of the movie where the character Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, basically thanks the character Del Griffin, played by John Candy, for everything he's done. And I love the part when he's on the train and he's having, picturing being at home with his family and the memories he had with Del Griffin. And then near the end of the movie, Del Griffin shows up at the train station where Neil Page stops at, and he says, "I want to help you get home to your family," and stuff like that. So then Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, and Del Griffin, played by John Candy, managed to walk to Neil Page's house. And then the movie ends on a happy note where Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, is able to happily visit his family. And then, and Neil Page introduces his family to his friend, Del Griffin. And then the movie ends with Del Griffin, played by John Candy, smiling. So, yeah, at the end of the day, this is a fantastic comedy movie. I watch it ever since I first saw this movie in 2021. I've been watching it every year for Thanksgiving. And I'm going to continue doing it for many years to come, because this movie's a Thanksgiving classic. And, yeah. Now, like I said, this isn't quite my favorite movie directed by John Hughes. I would give the slight edge to Uncle Buck, but at the same time, this is a great movie. And if people were to say that this was John Hughes' best movie, I mean, I can see why, because this movie is a classic. But yeah, on a scale of 1, and I know back in 2020, there were talks about doing a remake of this with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, who, do not get me wrong, I like them as actors, but we do not need a remake, because this movie is a comedy classic, and I'm glad that update did not go anywhere. But yeah, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Planes, Trains, and Automobiles a perfect score of a 10 out of 10. So yeah, anyways, guys, that was my review. Thanks for watching, and next up, I'll be covering some Christmas stuff in December. But until then, we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.